had one manager besides Buffett, and that was Henry Singleton, who ran. And Henry Singleton, so Charlie knew Henry, and Henry could play chess blindfolded with 8 people at the same time and beat them all. And he was just an amazing manager, amazing business person, great capital allocator. So he founded Teledyne in 1960, and when he was 40 odd years old. And from 65 to 70, he acquired 130 companies, issuing stock to acquire these companies. And typically he was buying these companies for like around 10 times earnings. And he was issuing Teledyne stock to the sellers. And the Teledyne stock was trading between 40 and 70 times earnings. So basically it was, you could think of it as a roll-up, but it wasn't really. So he was very heavily in aerospace. Then he branched out into a few other places, but he did a bunch of things which is very similar to the way Constellation Software runs, or maybe even some similarities to the way Berkshire runs. So when he bought a company, even if he owned very similar related businesses, he left those companies alone. And he left inefficiency in terms of they didn't try to consolidate the back office, put all the HR under one company, put all the payroll and accounting under headquarters or any of that. He kept the business unit independent with the inefficiencies of running everything as a separate business. And the reason he did that, the same reason that Constellation does it, is he wanted to hold the managers accountable. So the managers had incentives. Typically, they were the owners that had sold on the business, or maybe someone the owner had nominated to run the business. And so they paid very close attention to how these businesses were performing. And because they never integrated them with their acquisitions, they could easily do apples to apples comparisons and take care of that. Then in 70 and 72, when the bear market set in and Teledyne stock nosedived, its PE fell below 10, and he could no longer use stock to buy things. And what he did is from 72 to 84, in 12 years, Henry bought back more than 90% of Teledyne's shares outstanding. And his earnings in this 12-year period tripled. So he was at approximately $1.64 a share in earnings. And by 1985, he was $45 a share in earnings. The stock went up 40x over this period. And in fact, what Teledyne did is most of the buybacks were not done in the open market. He issued tender offers to buy back shares. And the first tender offer he issued in 74, he offered to buy 1 million shares, I think for $20 a share. And 9 million shares got offered. So he was really shocked at the number that was offered, and he took the entire 9 million. And then later he did 6 or 7 of these tender offers, and he didn't have the cash because the amount he was buying back outstripped the earnings. So what he did is he did exchanges. And so he told the shareholders that they could give Teledyne the stock they had, and in exchange, they got 10% debentures. And amazingly, all these people were very excited about taking the 10% debentures and giving him the stock. Nobody in the 70s wanted to own stocks. It was a terrible period in terms of returns, but it was a great period for Henry. So you look at Henry in the 60s, he's issuing shares furiously. And the 70s, he's buying back shares like crazy. If we do a comparison between Tim Cook and Henry Singleton, I know this is not a fair comparison because Tim didn't have the 1970s to work with. But Apple tripled its earnings in the last 10 years, and Teledyne tripled its earnings in 12 years. It took a little longer than Apple. So we have 1 for Tim and 0 for Henry in terms of the earnings growth. Apple bought back 39% of shares in 10 years, and Teledyne bought back 90% of shares in 12 years. Henry trounces Tim Cook, and Apple's up 6x in 10 years, and Teledyne's up 40x. And so here you see earnings going up very similarly, or the buyback period is also very similar in terms of it's 10 or 12 years, but you see a huge difference because the valuation deltas allowed Henry to buy back. And Henry was furious about the buybacks in the sense that he bought back well beyond the earnings of Teledyne. He took on debt to buy back the shares, and then later he retired all the debt. And so you see this 40x in 1985, and Henry knew Charlie, and he approached Charlie and Warren. I don't know exactly when, but my guess is somewhere in the mid 80s. He approached them, and he wanted to, after this 40x, sell the entire thing to Berkshire. And Berkshire was interested in buying Teledyne with a bunch of very high quality businesses. He even had bought a bunch of insurance companies and whatever. But what Henry wanted, I told you he pays chess blindfolded with 8 people and wins against all 8. He told Warren and Charlie that he wanted only Berkshire stock. He didn't want cash. So his final, I would say, brushes on the painting was to take the 40x. Then at that time, Berkshire shares were about $2,000 or $2,500 a share. And so it would have been about a 200x from then till now to his estate. And of course, Warren and Charlie balked at issuing Berkshire stock. And so that deal never took place. But Henry still did fine. And the interesting thing about Henry Singleton is the people he had on his board. He had guys, Sarofim in Dallas, the Egyptian Sphinx. You can look him up on Google if you've not heard of him. He passed away recently. He had Arthur Rock, who was one of the first venture capitalists ever in Silicon Valley, funded Intel and whatever else. And he had Claude Shannon. And Claude Shannon was a MIT professor, and he was a mentor to Ed Thorpe. So he really had, these are just amazing individuals. So Henry himself was amazing, but he had some really good advisors around him. So it's an interesting person to study. And there's a book that came out several years ago called Distant Force, which was written by Henry's number 2 guy, I think George Roberts. It's a great book to read if you're looking to learn more about Henry. And so again, furious pace of buybacks was key. Henry took on lots of debt that he paid back later. And Henry bought back well above the end. He really recognized when he had an opportunity and he went for it. So the key factors, how fast are the shares being retired? How quickly can we get to 80% gone? 80% shares gone means if the earnings are stable, you have a 5x. If there's no earnings growth and no multiple expansion. So you just get a 5x just based on shares being taken. And then you have to ask yourself, how much can earnings grow in this period? Earnings growth is key to multiplying that 5x. And then like Henry, can we buy back a lot of shares at low multiples and end up with high multiples and much higher earnings? And then we get to the promised land. And so when you look at people like Henry Singleton and Warren Buffett, Buffett actually did not want to ever buy back shares. So he had a little different ethos from Henry. He did not, in his words, want to play gin and rummy with his shareholders. So while Henry thought of his shareholders as faceless people, Buffett thinks of his shareholders as partners. And so he doesn't want to really make money off his partners. He wants to make money with his partners. And that's why for the longest time, Berkshire resisted buying back shares. And I think only more recently, he's given a lot of, I would say, disclosures and is willing to buy back, but he wants to make sure the other side has all the information or nearly all the information that he does. So anyway, a little bit different ethos between Henry Singleton and Warren Buffett. Rare to have CEOs who know when to do buybacks. So this is a very rare skill, when to pause and when to issue shares. If you actually end up with a CEO who's a great operator, great capital allocator, and exceptional at knowing when to do the buybacks and when to issue shares, you're like living in a utopian world. It's great. It's not great to be buying back shares at huge multiples. That just doesn't work.